now. I'm recording all of the classes that we'll have in here, so if you ever miss one, no worries, I'll have it on, and I mean, I may forget a day, but generally I'll try and record. I'll have them on MP3, and I'll probably post the classes on YouTube so that people have access to them. But there's a lot of reading in this class, and so what I want to say is, even if Civil War is my favorite class, which I don't think it is, I think this one is, but if I were teaching Civil War, I'd probably say the same thing in that class. So just to warn you, I'm not, I realize you can't have two favorites, but it's like saying, you know, you have like three best friends, right? You're really only supposed to have one, but you end up having several. So definitely a favorite class, but it is the hardest class I teach. And I want you guys to know that on day one. I don't think I'm that hard of a grader. I expect a lot. I mean, I definitely demand a lot, but I don't think I'm that hard of a grader, especially when it comes to my heritage classes. I think I'm actually too easy. But in this class, I tend to really be pretty strict because we go through so much, and I want you to really, I mean, it means so much to me that I want you guys to have. It's not, that makes it sound like heritage doesn't mean, it actually means everything to me too. But I really am very tough on this class. So I want you to keep up with the ideas, and I want you to keep up with the readings, but I want you to know that on day one. So if for whatever reason this doesn't look like the kind of class you want to take, I'll totally understand. I hope you all stay in, but I'll understand as well, just because there are so many demands and so much reading in here and a lot to take in. So what I've done for the class is I've given us 5 major readings. So 2 readings for the first half of the semester, 2 readings for the second half of the semester, and then the Eliot, which we'll probably get to in just a couple of weeks, and we'll take some time going through it. So the structure of the course is this. We're basically going to look at the major figures that influenced T.S. Eliot. Then we're going to spend a lot of time talking about T.S. Eliot, probably 3 or 4 full weeks just talking about Eliot and his ideas. And we're going to read his poetry a couple of times. So what we'll probably do in class, and again, this is all for the sake of openness and hoping that you guys will be interested in this, and if not, again, understood. But what I want to do is we'll probably, in class, we'll listen to T.S. Eliot read his own poetry. We'll do that, and sometimes that could take 20 or 30 minutes of a class, right? And that, when we have a 50-minute class, that means there are days that half of our class will be listening to Eliot. And then we're going to talk in great detail about what Eliot's poetry is trying to get at. And then after we've done that, we'll probably take turns in class reading the exact same poetry that we just heard Eliot do. So I want you to know that there are going to be times that we're going to be going over certain poems in here, probably 3 times, just to try and get the essence of it. And that's, I've been reading this stuff all my adult life. I started reading Eliot my senior year of high school because I had to memorize the Hollow Men. I couldn't graduate from high school. I mean, this was actually, it was a public school, but it was pretty good. So I had to give the Hollow Men to the class. Everybody had to memorize some Eliot poem. So he's been with me for a very, very long time. And my book here, which I've assigned to you, the kind of 5th book, which is the main book of the class, the complete poems and plays, this copy has been with me since college and has meant a great deal to me. But we really are, so the first third of the semester, roughly third, we'll be looking at the influences on Eliot. Then we're going to spend about the middle of the semester really focused on Eliot. And then at the end of that, we're going to look at figures who were influenced by Eliot. So Eliot is really at the heart of everything that we're doing in this class. So he is the beginning, he's the middle, and he's the end. But we're going to see ideas that are really floating around him as well. So, and obviously this is a history class, this is not a literature class, but one of the things that we're going to try and do in this class, not only through the science fiction we're going to read, but through Eliot's poetry, is figure out how does literature inform our understanding of history. Because Eliot has a very strong understanding of history. We may agree or disagree with his vision of history, but everything he's doing is historical. And what he really wants us to do, and I think this is Eliot's genius, what Eliot really wants us to do is to be inside the poem when we're listening to the poem. So this is part of his whole theory of Imagism, which we'll talk about. I don't know, we might get to it today. But his whole theory of Imagism is this idea that you don't stand as an observer to the poem, and you don't just become hypnotically entranced by the rhythm of a poem, but rather the poem is meant to really give you images of what is true and good and beautiful and evil as well. that you're to stand in it in some way. And so Eliot actually talked about this as being inside of a miracle, looking at the world through the eyes of the miracle, rather than looking at the miracle through the eyes of the world. So he actually wanted you to be inside the poem, to be within it as you view the world. And that we're going to see that repeatedly in his poetry, but also in the poetry that influences him as well. Now, I'm not a lit scholar, and I'm not a poetry scholar at all. I am definitely a historian. I am a humanist, but I'm definitely a historian. So we're going to be looking at this broadly from a liberal arts kind of perspective. I'm not going to be able to do, for example, the kinds of incredible intellectual gymnastics that someone like a Dr. Smith or a Dr. Franklin could do. Right? Those are, I mean, they're amazing in the way that they can analyze literature. I'm not going to be able to do that. So if you're looking for a literature class, this is basically someone playing at literature rather than actually being within literature. If I ever got a second PhD, which is not going to happen at my age, but I did think about it for a bit, I would go back in literature. But that's a different life in a different universe, maybe a parallel universe, maybe I don't know, a better or worse universe, but not the universe I live in. So I will remain a historian. So for the first half of the semester, we're going to read a very complicated science fiction novel, but very good, called That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. And we're going to talk quite a bit about the Inklings. The Inklings tried to offer a different vision from what Eliot was offering. So they're more in competition with each other than they are in alliance. But we'll talk about that. Some people have tried to argue that there is not just the Inklings, but an Oxford Christianity that brings together Eliot and Dorothy Sayers and the Inklings as well. I'm not as taken with that argument because I see their differences, and certainly there are religious differences as well as some political differences. In hindsight, though, I think Eliot and Lewis have a lot in common. They did not like each other at all until the end of their lives, and suddenly they became good friends. But they absolutely despised one another as young men. And we'll talk about why that was the case. Lewis especially despised Eliot. Eliot didn't have as many opinions about Lewis, but Lewis was quite obsessed with this. He used to spend class periods talking about how Eliot was the greatest evil in the world. But That Hideous Strength is incredible. It's one of the finest novels I've ever read. I'm rereading it right now. I'm about half done with it, getting ready for this class. And I've read it probably close to 15 times in my adult life. And there's something new in it every time. The same thing is true with Eliot as well. There's always something new in Eliot. But I'm assigning that now. So essentially start reading That Hideous Strength. And I'll pick a day in a couple of weeks. I mean, it can be more than a couple of weeks, probably in, say, 4 to 5 weeks, where I'll give you a week warning. I'll basically say next Friday, we're going to talk about That Hideous Strength, and we'll have a class period or two about it. But just start reading that and make sure that you're reading that in the background of class. The other thing I'd like you to start reading, and what I would recommend, because it is a fairly complicated book, is probably read like one chapter. I mean, just break it up. You have to have these books read. And if you don't have That Hideous Strength read by the time we talk about it in class, it's not a problem. I mean, it may be a problem for you just because you might be a little lost in the discussion, but I'm assigning them now so that you have them done by the midterm. So you definitely have to have both of these books done by the midterm. So That Hideous Strength and Judgment of the Nations. If I remember right, Judgment of the Nations is 8 chapters long. And probably the best thing to do would just be to read at least one chapter a week and make sure that you have that done by the time we get to the midterm. I may be strange in this way in terms of Hillsdale faculty, but I have absolutely no problem with you guys working together between now and the midterm, and then between the midterm and the final. If you want to split the readings, if someone in the class says, I'm going to read the odd chapters of Dawson, and someone says I'm going to read the even chapters, and you outline it and get the arguments, and you want to do it that way, that's fine. You guys can study any way you want leading up to the midterm and up to the final. Just make sure you know the arguments that are in those books. So feel free to kind of divvy up labor. I mean, you're still going to have to read it, but there's a difference between reading a chapter quickly and reading it very strictly for analysis. And that, I think you could probably break up if you wanted to. Judgment of the Nations is one of the best books I've ever read, too. I mean, these are all like Brad's greatest hits, as in terms of at least what I'm assigning you. I came across that book, The Judgment of the Nations, at Hyde Brothers Books, which is an excellent bookstore in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I came across it in the fall of 2001, so about the time most of you were born. And I brought that home and I devoured it, that book, over Thanksgiving break of 2001. And to celebrate the 20th anniversary, I did the same thing over this Thanksgiving break. It is just, it's an amazing book, dedicated, you don't have this in your copy, unfortunately, but it was dedicated to the English people to survive Nazism, not only in terms of war against the Nazis, but to survive their ideas as well. Dawson, I mean, just, guy's incredible. And that book was written in 1941, really in the absolute heart of darkness in terms of what Britain was suffering in World War I with the bombing of London and everything that was going on with the Nazis. And Dawson was trying to give hope and strength to the English, basically saying this is what we need to be fighting for. And if we fight for these things, I mean, as he says, and we may agree or disagree, but he says the Holy Spirit will be on our side. And even if we lose, we'll conquer through the Holy Spirit. So it's an amazing book, and I think it's really kind of a manifesto for what Christian humanism is. So then we'll have the Eliot book, that'll kind of bridge both semesters. And then second half of the semester, between the midterm and the final, we're going to read this really wonderful, odd book. Also, I have a personal history with it. On my honeymoon, Deidre and I were in, so my wife is Deidre, on my honeymoon, I mean, it would make sense. I was with my wife on my honeymoon. We walked into a used bookstore in Idaho, and on top of a stack of science fiction books was this book that had a cover depicting the world after a nuclear war. And of course, I was immediately drawn to it. And it was called Canticle for Leibowitz. And I picked it up and read it, and I never stopped reading it. It is, again, another just amazing book, but it is really weird. Just to warn you, it takes place 600 years from now, and then 1,800 years from now, and then 2,400 years from now. And it's what I would call Augustinian science fiction. The whole idea is based on Augustine's cycles of history and cycles of a republic and what a republic will do. So birth, middle age, and death, and then starting over again. But the end is pretty dark. I just want to warn you. And it's a deeply religious novel, but it's one of those novels where you can't quite figure out if he's making fun of religion or if he loves religion. The satire is so hilarious, but you really never know. So it's either the most pro-Catholic novel ever written, or it's the most anti-Catholic novel ever written. And I'm not sure which, and that may be your final question about the book as well. But it is a great novel, I promise you, and you'll get a lot out of it. And there's some non-politically correct things in it, but we'll deal with that at the time. And even those are mythologically really important as well. Specifically, there's the story of the Wandering Jew, which that's the non-politically correct or politically incorrect, but it makes for a great story, even if it's not necessarily nice in today's language. Okay, and then the final book that I'm assigning, and this is again for between the midterm and the final, is Russell Kirk's Prospects for Conservatives. And just to let you know what that is, Kirk wrote a book in 1953 called The Conservative Mind, and it was an earth-shattering book. I mean, it changed the whole political landscape in America and somewhat in England, not as much in England, but definitely in America. And the whole modern conservative movement arose out of that book in the 1950s and 1960s. But there were a lot of criticisms of Kirk, basically saying that The Conservative Mind was a work of poetry rather than a work of policy. And that's true. And Kirk's response then was to say, all right, let me give you a program for conservatives. Let me tell you what that program is, which was the first title of Prospects for Conservatives. And he says, here's my whole program. You should love one another. That's his response to his critics. And so the book itself is essentially about loving one another, but he breaks it down into a variety of things. And you've all actually read a part of it, because in your American Heritage class, you had to read Russell Kirk's A Problem of Tradition. That's a chapter from this book. So you're at least familiar with it. But Kirk wrote it. I actually had the privilege of looking at his manuscript. There were nights he was very angry, and he would usually write between about 11 at night until about 6 in the morning. And there were nights that he would write 10, 15,000 words in this book. He was so angry, and just at a white heat wrote these chapters, but they're in a white heat about love. So it's this kind of, and you'll see that in this class. There's going to be a lot of anger and a lot of love in the way that these people are thinking about things. Anger at the Nazis and the communists, love for trying to figure out what a republic or a Christian republic might be. So here's the main thrust of this, and I didn't mean to talk this long about the syllabus, but so you're going to have 3 grades in this class, and basically divided a third, and a third, not quite. But your midterm is only worth 30% of your class, but your final would be worth 35% of your class, and then your semester-long research paper, which I'm assigning right now at this moment, your semester-long research paper is a third as well, so it's worth your final. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking about the semester and you're thinking about how you're going to plan this out. What I would like you to do for that, and I'd like your paper to be basically about 15 to 20 pages. So it's going to be a major research paper about article length, you would have in an article in a published journal. I would like you to write on one of these figures that we're going to deal with, or at least an ally, and I've given you a whole list of people that you can write on, and it's a very diverse list. So Irving Babbitt was T.S. Eliot's main professor at Harvard, and if we don't talk about him today, we'll talk about him on Friday. Actually do probably a day or two just on Babbitt and looking at him. So you could deal with Babbitt. Babbitt was really one of the great founders of humanism, not Christian humanism. He was really much more of a pagan, but certainly there's a figure there. You could pick someone like Willa Cather, one of the great novelists of the 20th century, who would never have defined herself as a Christian humanist, but was a Christian humanist par excellence. It's just absolutely one of the greatest of the 20th century. You could focus on her novels. You could do a couple of different things about some of the essays she wrote about the nature of art. I have someone like William F. Buckley, if you're interested in journalism. If you want to figure out what we might do for a kind of conservatism, Buckley would be perfect for that. I have Abraham Heschel, who was one of the great Jewish humanists of the 20th century. So in this list, I've tried to give you a variety of different people. Sister Madeleine Wolfe was a poetess. She studied with C.S. Lewis and with J.R.R. Tolkien, and then became the president of St. Mary's College over in South Bend, Indiana. I have people like George Orwell. Thomas Merton was a monk, a Trappist monk in Kentucky, who wrote extensively about the nature of Christian humanism. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of the great martyrs of the 20th century, who also wrote significant aspects, especially on Lutheran theology. We have Sigrid Undset, if you want, again, another novelist related to Willa Cather, but on the Scandinavian side of things. Really, there are just a number of different people here. Frank Sheed, his papers are all at Notre Dame. He was one of the great publishers of the 20th century. And I'm open if there's someone that you want to write about. I have people like Bradbury in the main list. But if you wanted to write, for example, about Margaret Atwood, she's definitely not a Christian humanist. But The Handmaid's Tale is such a significant work of literature, and it deals with some of the themes we're going to talk about in here, that you could easily write on her. So what I'm really looking for is a kind of intellectual biography of these people. And don't let the intellectual part mess you up there. All that means is I want you to look at a person and figure out what their ideas were and how maybe their ideas shifted over time or developed over time. That's really the main thing that you have to focus on. And I think, and again, this list is not exhaustive. It's a starting point. If there's someone else that you'd rather focus on that I didn't mention, just email me and ask, and I'm sure we can figure something out. But I've tried to give you a pretty extensive list here, more than I assume we'll need in the class. And you can double up. I mean, if we have 2 people doing Buckley, that's not a problem at all with the way resources work. So don't worry about overlapping with someone. Just pick what you can and start working on that soon. So you can always come to me with those kinds of things. I would like you, as I have here on your significant dates for the semester, by February 4th, I would like you to get to me a research précis. That just means a synopsis of what you've been able to find and the kinds of questions you're asking with a bibliography. Get that to me by February 4th, so a little less than a month from now. have a good idea of what you're writing on. You don't have to be super formal in your précis. Basically, you can give me a page to a page and a half to 2 pages on what your topic is, what the kinds of questions are you're thinking about that you'll be asking in that paper, and then where you think you might have the solutions through the bibliographic sources. But do start that now. So please don't put that off. You want to get that going as soon as you can, especially since it's worth so much in the semester. And I take those papers very seriously. At the end of the semester, you'll turn them in, and I'll be spending probably the vast majority of my grading time will be grading those papers at the end of the semester before summer starts. So do put a lot into those. Okay, so any questions about that or what we're going to be doing in the semester? So again, Eliot is the key to everything in the semester, but hopefully we can figure out what this Christian humanism is beyond just a kind of basic understanding. So anybody have thoughts or questions on the syllabus? Nobody's rushing out of the room yet, so that's fine. That's a good sign. Okay, great. Oh, thanks. Did everybody get to sign this? Good, thank you. All right, and you were legible? Blake, where's Blake? Man, your handwriting. All right, well, I'll work with that. Thanks. Okay, good. So let's talk about Christian humanism then, and I want to give you a couple of different figures that I want to talk about. Oh, my notes just fell. We'll get these back. I was worried about that, actually. Okay, so Christian humanism is this thing, and my wife's itinerary did not mean to bring that. Do you guys want to know what flight she comes in on Saturday? Okay. Well, that's okay. I'll ad-lib here. So, Christian humanism. The most fundamental, basic understanding of Christian humanism is exactly what it sounds like. It is an understanding of the liberal arts and the humanities from a Christian perspective, and it is the understanding of Christianity as influenced by the liberal arts and by understanding what is liberal. And so when we think about something like Christian humanism, don't get too frustrated by the term or think of it as something like fascism or communism or some kind of ideology. It's not that. If anything, as Christopher Dawson said, it would be a supra-ideology. That is, it's beyond ideology in some way. It would transcend ideology. But there are a variety of different ways that we can approach this. So you've all had Christian humanist readings. All of you in this class have had them here at Hillsdale. And of course, you think about what is Hillsdale. We try to understand the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian tradition. And there's Christian humanism right there, or at least a Judeo-Christian humanism. And generally, when I say Christian humanism in this class, that's shorthand for Judeo-Christian humanism. If you saw on that list the number of Jews who are involved in this movement as well. And so we'll see that in terms of alliance, people like Leo Strauss, Rabbi Heschel, and others are involved in this. So it is kind of a Judeo-Christian movement more than it is a strictly Christian movement. But it really does just fundamentally mean a humanist, that is someone who teaches the humanities or believes in the humanities, who also happens to be within the Judeo-Christian religious tradition as well. That's the simplest definition of what a Christian humanism is. But then, if we really do focus on the Christian aspect of it for a moment, we get into the importance, and we're going to talk about this a lot in this semester, and whether we take it as a theological truth or as a philosophical concept, we're going to be thinking a lot about the nature of the incarnation. What is the incarnation? What does the incarnation mean in terms of Christ's incarnation, of the flesh becoming word, of the word becoming flesh? What does it mean for us? What are the implications for us as people if we recognize that God became us in some way? That's crazy when you think about the essence of it. At what point could the author enter into his book? At what point could an artist enter into his painting? And yet that's exactly what Christ does with the incarnation. It's what God does in the incarnation. So the incarnation is this incredible moment in history where you really see the coming together of everything that is transcendental, everything that is above us, But also, if you remember in the Incarnation, think about John's Gospel, John 1:9, it is the light that lighteth up every man. So it's not only connecting us to what's transcendent, it also connects us to each other. And notice the Gospel, in John's Gospel, it doesn't say all men from this point forward are enlightened by the Logos. It says all men are enlightened by the Logos. Right? That is the light that lightens all men, past, present, and future. So what we see, of course, and this is the Christianity in this, we see very clearly the idea of the cross and the nature of the cross when we think about what the Incarnation is. The pagans had a concept as well of this, didn't necessarily recognize Jesus as the Incarnation, but were looking for some kind of incarnation. The pagans understood this as logos, trying to figure out what the word was. And this word goes all the way back to Heraclitus. It goes back to almost 500 and some years before Jesus was born. The concept of a fire or a spirit or a word or a concept or an idea or an image, all of these things in terms of logos, all of these ideas come together in that Greek concept. And this will be, when we talk about especially Eliot's poetry, we're going to have to talk a lot about what we call Stoicism, this philosophy that comes about, that develops over time. And again, I told you guys you've all had Christian humanist readings. You think about, you have the pagan humanist readings when you had Epictetus all the way back in Western heritage, but then you also had Cicero, who's a great pagan humanist, and you had Socrates, who's a great pagan humanist, right? One of these guys who believes obviously in the liberal arts. The liberal arts in many ways come from Socrates. Cicero was the great Roman exponent of the liberal arts. But then you guys had to read a blatant Christian humanist. If you'll remember in the medieval part, right on the Renaissance, you had to read Petrarch. Petrarch was the ultimate Christian humanist of his day. And one of my, I've already brought him up once in class, one of my favorite people, one of my best friends, Dr. Smith, Steve Smith in English, he makes the point, and I think he's absolutely right, that every time you see a Christian humanism arise, you see Cicero or Augustine. Always. Right? This is constantly, if you have a revival of Cicero and a revival of Augustine, you're going to have a Christian humanist moment. You're going to have a kind of renaissance. And that was certainly true when we think about someone like Petrarch, who really was quite taken, of course, with Socrates and with Plato, wasn't as taken with Aristotle, but was so taken with Socrates and Plato, and especially his great exemplar, Cicero. So we've had these kinds of readings before, and we've seen those things. And if we look at the history of Christian humanism, Christopher Dawson tells us that the first moment of Christian humanism is really when St. Paul goes to Athens and he debates with the Epicureans and he debates with the Stoics, but he doesn't chide them for being totally wrong. He tries to find, and this is in Acts 17, he tries to find within the pagan community things that are related. And this is where Paul says two very important things. He says, number one, the Greeks recognized that there was an unknown God, because remember, they had a statue to the unknown God. And Paul says, this is great that you guys are humble enough to admit that you have at least a God you don't know. And of course, I have that God in the figure of Jesus Christ who can fulfill that. He doesn't convert a lot of people, but he certainly makes a great argument in doing that. I think he only converts 8 when he's in Athens, if I remember right. But at least he gets some, right? And he has this great debate. But the second thing he does is he quotes Stoic poetry. And in particular, he quotes, "In him we move and live and have our being." Acts 17, right? It's an incredible moment because this goes all the way back to the beginning of Stoicism when Paul delivers that line, and it's probably about 50 AD that he delivers that line in Athens. That line at that point is 350 years old by the time Paul delivers that, because in the original, it's in Zeus we move and live and have our being. It was a prayer that the Stoics offered up to Zeus. And as one of my other colleagues, Dr. Paul Ray, has pointed out, we think about our word for God, think about the idea in Greek of theos, and then you think about the idea in Latin of deus. These are both corruptions of Zeus, right? That's God is Zeus, right? That name means God. It's not the word we use because God for us comes from the Anglo-Saxon. But when we think about it in the Greek and Latin it's used, it's deeply related to the idea of Zeus. And so there it is. Paul, of course, doesn't say in Scripture, in Zeus we move and live and have. That would be a little much. But he does tell us, in him we move and live and have our being. He keeps that pronoun open. Very important. So we see Logos and we see the Incarnation as really the center of this idea of what Christian humanism is. So we're trying to figure out what does that mean for us as human beings, and that's one of the great questions that we're going to be asking throughout this semester. Essentially, what does it mean to be human? It's one of the great questions of the liberal arts. What does it mean to be human? How do humans interact with one another? And how do humans interact with God? Okay, those are the three great questions of the liberal arts, and we'll be asking those as well, especially thinking about these concepts that we have here on the board. So we'll find that Christian humanism then has a history that goes from the ancient world, even pre-Christian, into the Christian world. It is, as C.S. Lewis would say, baptized in the Christian world. That is, the Christian world baptizes the pagan world. And then we see a huge explosion in England, especially at the time of Erasmus and Sir Thomas More, right at the end of the great English Renaissance and at the beginning of the early modern period. We have this great explosion of Christian humanism. Thomas More uses the concept very directly. And then it kind of goes and fades into the background. And in between Thomas More and the 20th century, we do have a few people that we would regard as Christian humanists, but not many. We now enter into a period in Western civilization that is no longer really taken with the idea of revelation, but is taken almost exclusively with the idea of reason. And we get people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, these figures who are trying in their own understanding of philosophy and Descartes, trying to figure out what reason is, which is great. There's certainly nothing wrong with reason. In fact, logos is another word for reason, and we can talk about that as the semester goes on. But they don't mean that kind of reason. They don't mean the reason of the soul that is the image of what's beyond. They don't mean that as the divine logos. They mean basically the idea of imposing the will of the intellect upon society itself. And so we kind of lose that balance of reason and revelation for a bit in Western civilization. And the great person who will bring that back in terms of trying to kind of incorporate reason and revelation is Edmund Burke in the late 1700s. Through his writings and through his speeches in English Parliament, he really brings together a number of different things. But he is strongly a great Christian humanist. And then we find humanism, interestingly enough, as a term that becomes almost overused in the 19th century. Everything becomes kind of humanist because of the desire for the liberal arts to be applied, and it becomes overused. And one of the persons, and I'll talk about two figures today, and then I'll bring them up again on Friday, but one of the persons who brings this up in America is this teacher of T.S. Eliot, this Harvard professor by the name of Irving Babbitt. And Babbitt writes a book about the nature of liberal education. And in this book on liberal education, his first chapter is, what is humanism? And he gives us this idea, and this is really, even though he himself, Babbitt, is not a Christian at all. He likes Christ, but he likes Christ as a philosopher. He doesn't like Christ as Christ. He likes Jesus of Nazareth, not Christ. And he thinks Jesus is equal to Buddha and is equal to a number of figures, so I don't want to put too much on him. But Babbitt is really the beginning of the 20th century movement towards humanism, Christian humanism, because of the emphasis that he puts on understanding at least something beyond reason as well. And that is, we have reason, but it's reason properly understood within the context of a kind of revelation. Babbitt, in his argument, and I'll talk a lot more about this on Friday, but Babbitt, in his argument, basically says that within humans, one of the things that we find that is universal in the human condition is our desire to know what humanity is. This is part of the humanism and our desire to know who and what we are, and therefore to apply it universally. Once we recognize that there is a quality of being human, it has to apply to all peoples everywhere, past, present, future, black, white, male, female. There may be differences, but there's still a universal quality to who and what they are. And Babbitt then thinks that what makes us great, and this will never ever fly in modern America, unfortunately, but one of the things that makes us great, Babbitt says, is also our ability to restrain ourselves. So it's one thing to use our excellences, but we also, and he's worried that in our democratic society we've lost this ability, it also really matters that we have discipline in what we're doing, that we restrain the evil aspects of what we are, not just promote the good aspects of what we are. And he thinks that America is extreme, and Western civilization overall in the modern world have been extremely good at promoting individual excellences. It has not been so good in restraining evils. That is, in our things that we do wrong to one another, that we've become lax in our discipline about those things. And if you imagine and think back to Western heritage for a moment, this is a restatement of Cicero. Remember Cicero in De Officiis, in On Duties, that you guys had to read at least a part of for Western heritage. In that reading, and which of course was a letter to his son, Cicero says to his son, what defines you are not your rights, but your duties, how you act towards one another. This is what really defines your humanity, how you behave with one another, what you give to one another, how you act with one another. And Cicero gives us that great word, decorum, the ability to present oneself in a very good fashion, meaning a very moral and respectable fashion. And so Babbitt is very concerned with the notion of virtue and how do we apply virtue in the modern world. And his argument is that virtue is not just about love, which is helping one another, but it's also about restraining that which is wrong. So it's not just merely a positive thing to go out and do good. That's great, and Babbitt's all in favor of that. But he believes we've lost that part about restraining what's wrong with this as well. And I think, for any of us in this classroom, we could probably spend 20 minutes on Twitter and see how little restraint there really is in social media. And I think probably similar on something like Facebook as well. And those are symptoms, I think, of a society that's gone in this direction rather than causes, but they're also in some ways causes as well. So probably both symptoms as well as causes, but you can certainly see that. And not that, don't get me wrong, social media can be very fun too, and obviously you can see people riding horses and doing other really cool things. But there's also that side to it that can be really, really bad as well because of the kind of tribalism that comes about. So Babbitt is concerned with that. But the other figure I want to mention today is on the other side of the Atlantic, and a person who also has a huge influence on T.S. Eliot, a person by the name of T.E. Home. So it's spelled like home, but it's actually said home. I don't know if you can hear my difference. I barely heard it in my head. And basically I'm trying to say an Irish name with a Kansas accent, so you have to forgive me. But anyway, T.E. Home, we'll just say it like that. Home was this very interesting figure. He dies at age 34. He dies in World War I. He's killed in the trenches by a German shell. But he is the one who comes up with the idea of recognizing, along with Babbitt. So Babbitt's writing in America, Home is writing in England, and comes up also at the exact same time that Babbitt does with this expression of humanism. But he makes this distinction between what he calls a Renaissance humanism and a religious humanism. Two radically different things. The Renaissance humanism is the idea that we exalt the ego, whereas a religious humanism, which again we can call a Christian humanism, but a religious humanism is a humanism that restrains the self in terms of acting justly, but also with love in the way that we deal with one another. So Holm is, I don't know any other way to describe him. I'll bring a picture of him, man. I mean, once you see the guy, he's very formidable looking. He was extremely tall. He was extremely stocky and tall. He was a very, 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 very big man. Babbitt was a really big man too, which is interesting. They were both extremely tall and well-built and both very, very athletic. Babbitt, I didn't tell you about Babbitt yet. I'll just tell you really quickly, and I'll probably repeat this on Friday. Babbitt was once arrested in Paris because he was very frustrated with a book that he was working on, and late at night he went for a run, and nobody in Paris said that this was not a fashion where you go for a run. And so he put on his running shoes, his tennis shoes, and he went for a run about midnight in Paris, and the police chased him down and caught him and arrested him for being a vagrant in the middle of the night, because this was, anyway, Babbitt, he's very cool. He's a very good guy. But Holm was like that as well. These guys who are not just intellectual, but very vigorous in their physical lives as well. And Holm was what we would call an angry young man. He was brilliant, and he had a very difficult time expressing himself growing up. Went to Cambridge, got kicked out of Cambridge because he got into too many fights while he was there. So the university actually kicks him out. He goes to Canada, where he decides that in Canada, he has an aunt in Canada. He decides he wants to walk across the Canadian Shield. And so he goes for a 3-month hike, a walking tour across Canada. And as he crosses Canada, he encounters the Rocky Mountains. And he's so overwhelmed by the Rocky Mountains that the first time he sees them, he actually has a religious experience, has a religious conversion. This moment where he recognizes, and he really does kind of change as a person. That anger that was so much a part of him really moves more into his intellect than it does into his physicality after this. And he goes back to England, and he starts a group of poets that meet a couple of times a week, much like the Inklings will do, and they read their poetry to each other. And what Holm creates, and he is the father of this, he creates what's called Imagism, which is the kind of poetry that T.S. Eliot excels at. So Eliot will always be remembered as the great Imagist poet, but it really is Holm who creates it in the first place. And he only publishes, in his lifetime, he only publishes 6 poems. He writes a lot more than that, but only publishes 6. And I may read one of them to you. They're really short on Friday. I don't think they're that great, but they're very interesting. I mean, nothing like Eliot, but they're very interesting because it's clear that the poetry, going back to what we talked about almost an hour ago now, the poetry is all about the creation of an image. It's the idea of really, you think about something like stained glass. What is stained glass? Stained glass is story in an image. That's what Imagism is about. It's meant to kind of tell a story in what that image is, in what that thing is. It's meant to represent something much greater than itself. And this is what Holmes says poetry is about. We don't want it to be hypnotically rhythmic. We don't want the meter to put us into such a way that we become mere spectators or partakers in a vague sense of what it is. But we need to be startled. And that's, unless we get that idea of Imagism, we're going to miss, I think, much of what's in Eliot. So poetry is really meant to tell a story, but it does so not hypnotically, not rhythmically, but it does so by startling us with images. And this, for someone like Holm, was a Christian way of understanding this, because if Christ is the image of God, and man is the image of Christ, or we're made in his image, then poetry is the image of language. It's the way that we understand the world, and they considered it to be higher than either kind of metered poetry, and they considered it to be higher than prose. There was something about poetry in and of itself that could startle us with these images. They paint pictures in some way. So that was a huge part of what Holm was trying to get at. And there you can see, again, whether we agree with him or not, that Christian humanist element of trying to figure out what does the incarnation mean. Well, here it's actually being applied to art. It's being applied to poetry itself. And one of the things that we see around this group that met with Holm And it included people like Ezra Pound, and it included T.S. Eliot, and a number of other prominent figures, Wyndham Lewis, other very prominent figures of this day. It wasn't just poetry. There were also sculptors who were there. Joseph Epstein, one of the great sculptors of the early 20th century, was a member of this group, and there were painters as well. So you really have a kind of overarching group of artists who are meeting and trying to figure out. So that's the last thing I'll say today, and we'll close it. One of the most interesting things we see about these Christian humanists, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about Home or Eliot with the Criterion, his magazine he edited, or Russell Kirk later on, all of these Christian humanists are trying to create little communities. They're always trying to do that. They're always trying to propose things, and we see that with the Inklings as well. They're always trying to create communities that then express in some way not only what art is, but get it out to the public as well. Okay, anybody have any final questions or thoughts? If not, I'll call that a first good class, and thank everybody, and I'll look forward to seeing you on Friday. So have a great Wednesday and Thursday.